And we are live. I'd like to welcome everyone to another episode of Heart to Heart with Bree. Tonight's topic is unresolved grief, and my guest is Angria Basset. Would you please introduce yourself to the viewers, Angria?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Bree, for having me.
You're
And
welcome.
thank you to all the guests on the live. I'm Angria Bassett. I am a nurse and I'm a counselor. I work with people who are addicted to any kind of substances, including gambling, and I do grief counseling. But we're here to talk about grief tonight. I have my own experience of grief. I've got a master in public health, and I just love to minister and to share with people. So I pray that something that we say tonight will be of a blessing to you.
Yes, I really appreciate you coming on this platform. I saw an episode of In the Living Room with Angria, and it was a two-part episode, which I will share on my wall. And she was talking about grieving the loss of her husband, and I was so moved by how she shared so authentically about her loss. And we've spoken a couple times on the phone, and it was really helpful to me on my journey of grief. As many of you know, I lost my eldest child to an asthma attack in 2016. In fact, today it's exactly 8 years since his passing. So this topic is very important to me. And, it took me back to reading a book about dealing with loss. And the author mentioned that when we're going through a grief process, it's important to grieve when we go through a loss. And he said, if you do not grieve, he compared it to standing up to the waves. And he said, you may a few may come and not knock you over, but eventually one of
Mm,
those waves will knock you down.
yep.
And he said that's the grief process. If we do not face it, that eventually it will cause havoc in our lives. And I came to see that because it took me so long. Like, yeah, I faced the loss, I accepted it, but I tried to sweep it to the back of my mind, and that did not work. This is 8 years, and I'm finally able to see things more clearly. So that is why I'm doing this topic. So, my first question to Angria, and for the viewers, if you have a question, please feel free to post it in the comments. So, Angria, what is grief?
Yeah, so grief is a very human condition. The longer we live, we will experience some sort of grief. So, grief is really our body's response to a loss of a loved one. It could be a pet, it could be a job. It's a loss. And so, that grief, that pain comes through waves and waves and waves. And I say that deliberately because just like Bree said, if we thought it was one big strong wave that's going to just knock you down, it's going to be an event, it's not. And that's why grief is considered to be a process. Okay, it's not an event. The death or the loss is the event, but grief is a process. And the next question we may ask is, well, how long is this process? I ask myself that question, like, how long, God? How long is this going to last? You know? And there is no time frame, there is no timetable. Some literature suggests that normal grief should last between 1 to 2 years. And that's just the experience of the grief. It doesn't mean that grief is done after 1 or 2 years. As a matter of fact, we're talking about unresolved grief, which for some people, grief doesn't start until years later, months, weeks, years after the loss, the initial loss. So we cannot talk about grief without talking about pain. Grief is not a laughable a happy or enjoyable process.
No, it's not.
I I beg for anyone to tell me that they've been through grief and it was enjoyable. I have not found it so, not with the people I've worked with, and definitely not with myself. It the depth of pain that one experiences with grief, I have nothing to compare it to. I have had three children, three natural deliveries, three long, painful labors, and I cannot compare those to my experience of the pain with grief. It's like a pain that is so deep, you can't touch it, but it's there. It feels like a knife is lodged in your heart. It feels like your heart is being crushed. You know, sometimes we talk about grief and people will say, oh, it's like a broken heart. It is, to me, it's deeper than a broken heart. This is like a crushed heart. It's like your soul is crushed, it's dismantled. It's, I mean, during my, my acute phases of grief, it's like I couldn't even find my soul if I tried. And soul being the mind, the will, the intellect, you know, your inner being. It's like I call it also a confusing time,
Very
a
much so.
terribly confusing time where, in spite of what you know, all the familiar things, your intellect, and all of that, nothing makes sense, you know? So, even with people who are trying to be helpful, some of the things they say they make absolutely.
It is absolutely ridiculous. I'd like to welcome Irene Roper. Thank you for joining us, Irene. You know, I can say this. When I found that my son had passed away, I was in shock. I
Mhm.
was in shock. It was hard to eat, it was hard to sleep. I
Yeah.
was confused. It was just hard to fathom that he was no longer here. And what made it even harder was as time went on, and I'm talking about a few weeks later after his funeral, being told basically, and it's not by one or two people, it was several people, like it's like you're not trusting God, or
So
you
letting
haven't let
go.
him go, you haven't let him go.
Mhm.
And it's like, it's almost like if you're a Christian, then why are you still grieving? And what that did to me was oh, thank you. My mom is on, and so is Sonia Wilson. Thank you so much for joining. And so what that did to me was I was confused, and I held a lot of feelings in. And I remember one night I felt as if I was about to have a heart attack,
Mhm.
but it was because of holding in all this
The
pain and all
emotions.
this. I didn't want to tell anyone what I was feeling because I didn't want anyone to think that I was losing my mind.
Yeah.
But to be honest with you, I believe that I was. So sweeping grief under the rug, after a while, I believe it does lead to that unresolved grief because you're not facing it. It's
Mhm.
very painful, but unless we face it and deal with it, we're forever stuck. So I'd like you, Angria, to explain what is unresolved grief.
So unresolved grief is a deviation from what is so-called normal grief, meaning it's continuing beyond 2 years. The symptoms, some of which you've already called out, Bree: sleep loss, confusion, just not eating, sleeping, oversleeping, just cannot function adequately, not being able to take care of your activities of daily living. You know, sometimes people wonder, like, how could that be? Like, you don't feel like having a bath, you don't feel like interacting with people. One of the things I want to also mention is this feeling of being so vulnerable. You feel at risk. You feel
Yeah.
like if that happened to my loved one, then how safe am I? You question whether you're safe with people,
Yes.
even well meaning, well thinking people. You just don't feel safe. You don't feel safe to express, how you really feel, because we judge ourselves while we're in grief. I
So
mean,
true.
I know I judged myself. I was like,
Yes.
gosh, you've taught and you've worked with so many people who are going through grief, and you can't even do it yourself, and you're supposed to be this Christian, and you're not trusting, so we sometimes internalize these things and we judge ourselves, in addition to blaming ourselves, feeling like we could have stopped, prevented, what has happened. Why didn't I
Yes.
know? If I was a good wife, I should have known. I should have seen. Matters worse, and I'm a nurse. You should have seen symptoms. You should have seen the signs. So, the unresolved grief takes on all of these elements in addition to the prolonged pain and the intensity of the pain. It's like it doesn't let up. A lot of times we hear people say that, time heals, and time, it does get better.
It
Does it
does.
heal? I'm not sure if it heals.
I don't think so, if I'm to be honest.
It gets a little bit easier to live with it,
Yes, I agree.
and to live with the absence of the loved one, you
Yes.
know. But is it really healed? You
I
know?
I I totally get that because today, 8 years later, and I shared with you earlier, my daughter and son-in-law and grandson, we went to put flowers on my son's grave. And I broke down. I couldn't help but cry.
Yep.
And it took me back to when it happened, the
Mhm.
shock of it. It took me back to, I remember, because everyone knew that my son was very close to my mom. He was her first grandchild. And I remember them saying, "You have to call your mom. You have to call your mom." And I remember exactly what I said. How can I call my mom to tell her that her grandson is gone? I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And I remember calling my cousin and I asked her to please go and I will never forget how hard she cried. And it's like these are things that replay in my mind. And like what you said, I have questioned myself so many times. My son died from an asthma attack, and I often wonder, did he knock on my door? Did he call out for me? How could I have not hear that, that he was struggling? And then the thing is, I went to work. When I went to work that morning, he had already passed away. And I believe it was just the Lord because that morning his light was on in his room. I could see it under the door. And first thing that came to mind is, why did he sleep with the light on? Now I'm thinking about the light bill.
Yeah.
And I went to his door, but it was like something just said, don't open his door. If I would have opened his door, I would have been the one to find him.
Yeah.
And I thank the Lord for that I didn't open that door. But I will say that what a lot of people don't understand is post traumatic stress disorder is real because I look back and I realize that I was traumatized that day to come home from work to see the police, the fire truck, and all of that outside my house. And I'll never forget when I heard someone say, "That's his mother." And a couple of church sisters were outside and they were like, "Oh, Sister Bridget." I knew in my heart something terrible had happened. And when I went to the door and I asked them, I said, "Is he okay?" And the officer couldn't even look at me. And I remember I said, "Did he pass away?" I didn't want to say die. For some reason, passed away seemed better.
Or
But I will
acceptable.
never forget when he nodded his head. I remember I fell to my knees and I let out a scream. I've never screamed like that in my life, but I was in shock. And I remember when the police officer was talking to me and he kept referring to my son as a deceased.
Yeah.
I remember saying to myself, like, what is he talking about? Like, why is he referring to my son as a deceased? My son is Demetrius. Like, it just, the dots were not connecting. So, to be honest with you, like, one of my favorite TV shows is A Twilight Zone. And I actually felt like I was in an episode of The Twilight Zone. I was so stuck. And I'm telling you, it was like a couple days later when my mom came down for us to plan his funeral. When my mom hugged me and she said, Bridget, I'm so sorry, I felt like I was a 5-year old girl. And I needed my mother at that time. I just was so relieved to see my mom because, to be honest with you, I was so confused and stuck. So, grief is such a traumatic experience.
Yep.
And one of the things that I would like to point out to the viewers is this, and you can tell me if you agree with me, Angria. When a person is grieving, more than likely they're in shock. They're not necessarily in their right mind.
Yep.
Please
I
do not. But go ahead, go ahead.
I have a theory about that.
Yes,
I feel like from my experience, it's definitely a shock. It's trauma.
yes,
Okay? It's
yes.
trauma. It's like, how could this be? What do you mean this person is gone? What do you mean? It's like,
That's how
it's
it
like
feels.
our brain cells cannot cope with
It's
that
hard to accept it.
information. It makes no
It's
sense.
hard to process that. It's hard. It's
My
hard.
theory is that the whole brain does not process the whole event.
I agree.
And so, because I don't think we could cope with that.
No,
And so, a week later, a month later, a year later, it's like certain parts of the brain or certain brain cells, they are just coming back from vacation. And
it's
they're like,
true.
what? What did you say? And then you go
It's
through
true.
this whole thing again. That's the waves, the undulating, relentless show up of this pain, because I believe that some of our brain cells just didn't get the memo.
I totally agree with that. Mikey Go, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It is such a I will say this. I remember the first negative thing that was said to me in the grieving process. And I was in shock. I was in shock because I remember thinking, who does that to someone who is grieving? And what I would like to say to the viewers is that if you do not have compassion, if you do not have empathy, leave the grievers alone. Because what you do is you cause a lot of damage because it's already a state of confusion that's taken
Mhm.
place. And you simply add to the trauma, you add to the damage, and a person, they may remain stuck in
Yeah.
the process. They can't move forward. And I can tell you, I went to bed every night and I remember, like, I would tell myself, okay, when I go to bed tonight, I'm going to have a dream and it will, I'll wake up the next day and he'll be back. This
Yeah.
is a bad dream. And I did this every night up until the morning of his funeral. And that's when I realized it's not a dream. This
Mhm.
this is real. So I'm telling you, please, at a time like this, a person they need love, they need understanding, they need compassion, they don't need judgment, they don't need condemnation, they don't need their walk with God questioned, because I love God and I trust God. And I struggled even then to admit, because I remember someone say to me, you can't question God. But deep down, I wanted to question God. Deep down, my faith was shaky. And I
Yeah.
remember saying it all the time. I know my son didn't die because, God doesn't love me or doesn't love him. But there were questions and there was that internal struggle. So, I know that you can relate to it. I mean, how did you go through that process?
Well, to begin with, you know, my faith did not allow me to prepare. My situation was different to yours, Bree. Your child was healthy, went to bed, and had an event, and it's gone. You know, my husband had a diagnosis of brain cancer in January, um, and May 18th, he was gone.
Wow.
And during the 4 months and one day, I'm every bit of faith that I could find. I mean, reading the scriptures more, praying more. I mean, fasting and, taking communion and you name it, I did it. And I was encouraged by the faith of others that he was going to live and not die and declare the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. That is a real scripture.
Yes.
And yes, we can hold on to it. And I held on to it. Um, Unfortunately, that did not materialize. There are some for him, that is. There were times when the Lord would show me certain things and actually try to prepare me. And I remember once I was attending to him and I heard, a voice say, I'm taking my son quickly. And initially, because of my faith, I went to war with the enemy. Like, I bind you, Satan, and all of that. How dare you. And then it dawned on me that my husband is a believer. So I'm taking my son. That must be the Lord. And I shared that with other people of faith, and I was totally rebuked, you
Wow.
know? And so I was left wondering, did I really have that relationship with God that I could hear from him, which I have heard from him for, many times over the years. And so it planted some seed of doubt in me whether I could hear, whether I did hear God speak to me or not. And, so I was not given any space to even prepare. Not that I would have,
Yes, I
truth be known.
understand.
I, but there was no space in there. It was like, he's going to be healed. He's going to be healed. That's it. And so when he died, um, I was left with shock and awe and bewilderment and angry at God, disappointed, even ashamed. And I can tell you what the shame was about. The shame was about me being a Christian. And did I not pray enough? Did God not hear my prayers? So it took me a while to come around to the sovereignty of God, and that even though you pray and ask in Jesus' name,
Yes.
certain things will be answered a different way.
Yes.
But during that period, it just kind of gathered together, and for me, I experienced a crisis of faith. You know, does what I believe in, is that true? Does God, take pleasure in all this pain? Like he knew that this was going to be very, very painful. What kind of God is this? And it was the hardest thing for me to be asking these questions and feeling these emotions and wrestling with a faith that I had basically shored up over my lifetime.
Yes.
And in as much as I knew who God was during that time, there were so many questions and doubts. And yes, I was also told, don't question God. It was his time, and da 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 da, and how good God is, and so on, and just worship God and so on. The truth is, people, that when you're in that level of pain, worship may be the best thing for you to do, but it's the hardest thing because you're still considering, what's my relationship with God right
Yes.
now? What is my
Yes.
relationship? Who does he know me to be? Is this part of some kind
Yes.
of sick rebuke? Is this something that I have done wrong? Is this recompense? So you go through
Yes.
all of this
I
stuff.
get it.
I'm telling you that even now, for me, it will be 6 years in May. And I have just, I've resolved a lot of those things over the period of time. But initially, it was a battle, you
And
know.
let's be honest. I'd like to welcome my cousin Lennon. Thank you so much for tuning in. You're not less of a Christian because you go through these natural emotions. Because to me, it's quite natural to
It
feel
is.
that way, And I think that for Christians who choose to chastise you for feeling what is quite normal in grieving loss, I think it's a very cruel thing. I think we need to allow people to be during such a sensitive time because it's hard enough that you're questioning your sanity, you're questioning your relationship with God, you're questioning everything that you
Everything.
ever know to be true. You're confused, and it's like more than likely you're not sleeping, like I said, not eating. I would like to welcome Katina. Thank you so much for joining. It's such a difficult time, and it's such a time of struggle, a time of conflict, and a time of just, it's like, what is normal? I remember my cousin saying to me, this will now be your new normal. And I didn't want a new normal. I
No.
wanted my old life. I wanted Demetrius back.
Yep.
I just wanted to go back. I'm telling you, I tried my best to dream myself back to the day before my son died. It may sound crazy to some people, but all I wanted was to have him back. And one of the things I went through, because he was a young adult, and parents and their young adult children, sometimes they have disagreements. And it was like Satan was reminding me of every argument, every disagreement that we ever had. And I remember questioning myself, was I a good mother? Why did this happen? But like I said, it took a lot, it's taken years
Yeah.
to process all of this and, to be honest with you, to feel sane, because
Yeah.
I felt quite insane for a few years. I really did.
Oh yeah. The grief and insanity, I think they are very much probably twins.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
you
agree.
really do feel like you've lost not only the person, but you've lost it.
It's the truth. I'd like to welcome Carol Jackson, my dear friend. Thank you for tuning in. It is such a difficult time, and I'd like to ask you this question next. Grief can be it can be a very overwhelming process. Please stress the importance of facing it. And I'm asking this question because I just remember for years not wanting to be honest with how I was truly feeling, and not admitting how hurt I was, how disappointed I was, and just pretending and going through life, but it was always stuck at the back of my mind. Now that I faced it, there's such a big difference in my life. But back then, choosing not like the waves knocking me down, that's basically what I was feeling. So, what's your take on that?
Well, I think with such pain, it has to be handled with love and gentleness. If you are a rough, harsh person, or you think, just whip somebody in shape, you're not the right one to deal with somebody who is in grief.
Yes.
Even in unresolved, complicated grief, there has to be some gentleness, some love, compassion. Don't expect that people are going to grieve just like you grieved. Okay. And in answering the question, what happened when we don't face it? Well, it faces us.
Yes.
I'm telling you, it will show up everywhere and in everything. And based on the body of work that I've done dealing with folks with addictions, 85 plus percentage of people have some unresolved grief that led to the substance use and the continued use. Okay. And let me tell you, the, not dealing with grief doesn't make it go away, and it doesn't make it easier. I know we all like to try and avoid things if it's uncomfortable, let's not deal with it. Quite a few clients have told me in the past, they're like, oh, Mrs. Bassett, just don't worry. I dealt with that. I'm like, okay, let's talk about it. And then the tears, start flowing. I would strongly advise everyone to walk through, don't rush through.
Right.
I wanted it to be over, but rushing through it does not work either.
Doesn't.
Sometimes you have to crawl through, slither through the grief, okay? And because grief comes like waves, sometimes they're nice, mild waves where you can have little tears, just a few little tears, and another minute or another day, it will be overwhelming, weeping and wailing, like it
Yes.
just happened, like somebody just called to say this has happened. The shock is back in full force. So I don't advocate not dealing with it. I know people deal with it differently,
Yes.
and based on the circumstances, the suddenness, um, the age, whether it was unprepared, that you had no time to prepare, even to get few brain cells engaged in the process. You know, people deal with grief differently. But the unresolved grief and the delayed grief causes havoc on our bodies, our physical body. We know it affects our breathing system because half of the time when you're grieving, we start holding our breath.
Yes.
Okay. We will spend moments without breathing. Okay. We hold our breath to withhold the pain. So,
It's true.
a lot of breathing problems, we end up not oxygenating our cells well enough. So, we end up with imbalances, chemical imbalances, and so on. Okay. Heart conditions also can happen. Grief is like a broken heart or a
It
crushed.
is.
So physiologically, we can the heart is dealing with all that emotion, whether it's pent up for weeks, years. That heart is still dealing with it. There's no part of the body that is spared this experience. The whole body,
True.
the whole mind, the whole soul. I think that's why we feel so confused because our mind is just like, I can't cope, I can't cope, I can't cope with
That
all of
is
this. I'm
exactly how
confused. I don't know what to do. You know. Yeah.
that is exactly how it feels. There was a day that I went to work, and this was like maybe a couple years after my son had passed. And I remember I unpacked a nebulizer. And when I saw the nebulizer, I just broke down. And when I say I broke down, and I was at work, I broke down. And the young lady that was working with me, she ran to get the manager. And he had me, say, come and sit in my office.
Mhm.
And I will never forget a co-worker who was one of my church sisters. She started yelling at me. She started yelling at me, and she basically was like, what is wrong with you? Go and wash your face and drink some water. That's exactly what she said to me. And I remember I was so angry. And I said to her, "What if it was your damn son?" And I said, "What is a drink of water? What is washing my face going to do for me right now?" I was so, I can't even begin to explain what that did to me. And I remember, like, the shock of, no, you're my church sister. And it's like the fact that you would even say something like that to me. I mean, that was one of the most hurtful experiences I've ever had. And, to break down at work, because when I go to work, I believe in being a professional. But the
Yes.
human side of me kicked
Hmm.
in that day, because the first thing that came to my mind was his nebulizer couldn't save him. I
Yeah.
couldn't save him. And it was just a whirlwind of emotions that took over that day. So I'd like to stress that again about having compassion towards someone that's grieving. No one wants your pity. And I'm sure you would agree with me, Angria. You don't want anyone to feel sorry for you, but it's just simply some understanding that this is a very delicate time. Because, you said it earlier. When my son died, I stopped feeling safe. I
Mhm.
did not feel safe. I just couldn't make sense of this world anymore.
Yep.
Nothing made sense. No, absolutely. I mean, nothing made sense. So, this is leading on to my next question, where I can tell you that I started to internalize things because I felt like, you know what, I don't want to be told to get over it. I don't want to be criticized for not being a good Christian. And, you know, what I started to feel was, there were a couple times, to be honest with you, my mom is on, and I hate for her to even hear this, but there were a couple times where I actually felt like I just wanted to take my own life, because I did not want to live anymore,
Mhm.
because the pain was so intense and nothing made sense to me. I felt so misunderstood. I've never felt so misunderstood in my whole life. But when I think back to not sleeping, not eating, it just was like there's a lot of things I don't remember because it was just such a traumatic time in my life. But what I realized as time went on was, like, I started to have a better understanding of complicated grief, because I was going into that phase. I could tell one thing with me, I'm a reader. I
Mhm.
like to understand when I was pregnant, I read about childbirth. I like to have an idea of what I'm going through. But as much as I was reading about all of this, I found out that I couldn't control what was
Mhm.
taking place.
Mhm.
I wanted to control the process. I wanted to control the timeline of it all. And
Yes.
I wasn't able to do that. So I would like you to address complicated grief. What happens when a person gets into that phase?
Yeah. So with complicated grief, we are starting to have these prolonged experiences of the pain. And it's almost like it just happened. It just keep happening, and it's a one prayer that we have is to bring back this person. Let it not be
Yes.
so.
Yes.
And it's the one prayer that is not going to be answered. So you feel helpless sometimes, sometimes hopeless. Sometimes it can, with complicated grief, everything can become so exaggerated
Yes.
that it's hard for even our faith to let us know that things will be better because you just can't feel it right now. We're in the space that we're at. And a lot of times people are like, praying for you, we're praying for you. And sometimes they feel helpless too, because it seemed like their prayers are not being answered because we're taking so long.
Right.
You know, it's like, at least when you're grieving, you feel that there should be a timeline,
Yes.
and there is none. And then
Yes, I
especially
agree.
with normal grief, where people say it should be between a year and 2 years, and when you find that you are approaching those deadlines, so to speak, and you're not feeling no better,
Yes,
you know, and when the thoughts, when your life is so impacted by the loss that you have to face the fact that additional help is needed.
yes,
Question is, from who? Where do you
yes,
turn to get this help? There are lots of places that are dedicated to working with persons who are going through grief, early, acute phase grief, and what we're talking about, unresolved and complicated or traumatic grief. Because there's some specific things that occur, when you're grieving, especially the loss of a child at any age or stage. That is supposed to be one of the most painful grief for anybody to go through. I cannot imagine that because mine was so painful and my husband was not my child, you know.
right.
So I can only imagine, what that pain, that
I
loss.
think with the loss of a child, I think because we expect for our children to bury
Live
us.
us,
And in
yes.
the circle of life, for to bury a child, it feels so unnatural,
Unnatural.
and it
Yeah,
just did not make
yeah,
sense. So
yeah.
I think that may be why it's so painful. But I've lost my father a couple years ago, and I felt it in a different way than I felt the loss of my son.
Yeah.
But I definitely did feel the loss. There's a question here for you. Katina wants to know, what advice would you give my 16-year-old daughter who lost her father a year ago, or for her to correctly support her daughter?
So, understanding, love, talk about it. I know that is sometimes the most difficult thing to do because a lot of times we feel that if we even mention the person who is lost, we're causing more pain. We're
Yes,
digging it up, but that's not the case. We want to honor the memory and we want to talk about it. We want to encourage your daughter to talk about what she's feeling. What is it like for you? And not judge her. She has no experience with this. I didn't have any personal, well, I've lost my father and my mother, and they're totally different experiences from losing my husband of
yes,
34 years, you know. So I would encourage you to engage your daughter in conversation, let her know it's okay. Sometimes she may not want to talk about it because she may think that it's going to hurt somebody else. I remember when I lost my mom and I was grieving her, and I grieved her for 1 year. I cried every single day, dried my eyes, showered, combed my hair, went to work, was very normal until the next day. Go through this for 1 whole year. And I noticed that my kids did not want to say grandma. And when I noticed that, I'm like, they're trying to protect me from the pain, but they're grieving too.
yes,
They lost their grandmother. So when I realized what was going on, I turned to them and I said, no, guys, you got to talk about your grandma. You got to talk about how you feel, whether it makes mommy cry or not. It's important that you talk about what you're feeling, what the loss of your grandmother means to you.
yes,
And, I'm going to be okay. I may cry, but we need to talk about it. So that's what I would really encourage you with your daughter. She is a young person. Um, I have this empathy for young people going through grief because The pain that I experience as a grown woman, I cannot imagine young
Mhm.
people
Yes.
feeling that level of pain, the confusion. Um, Another thing I want to say, I remember when my mom passed, my father had passed many years before my mom passed. And do you know that I was probably 45, 46, married with children and very independent, but I felt like an orphan. And I actually said to myself, I'm like, oh man, no, I'm an orphan. Well, you know, an orphan is a child that doesn't have parents, have lost parents. I was grown up, but I felt like an orphan and all that that entails. Okay, unprotected, unloved, uncared for, not belonging, So when I work with young people and grief, I usually like to talk about that. What
Yes.
does the loss feel like for you? You
Yes.
know, for her, Dad is not going to be able to walk me down the aisle. Dad is not going to be at another graduation. Dad's not, da, 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 and all of that. Just like with Brie, not going to have grandchildren from, not going to see certain things happen and certain dreams and, you know,
Yes.
so all of that is part of the grief process, and we can't pretend as if they're not.
That is so important. And the next question I'd like to ask you about is the milestones. Like today was a milestone. And what I have found myself doing, like for the milestones, like a birthday, whatever, I try to plan an activity. I plan to do something. And maybe I don't want to call it a distraction, but I find myself trying to be intentional about the day. So like I told myself that, my daughter and I, we went and we laid flowers on his grave this morning. I told you earlier that last night we did vision boards,
Yeah.
something to be hopeful for the future. And I found that planning activities and like even having you come on tonight, it was intentional. It helped me somehow. I found it healing. So I would like you to address the milestones as they approach. How should they be handled?
I know the first year is was the hardest
Yes.
because there comes the birthdays, the anniversaries, the date of the death, and all of those things come up. The second year, the same thing. Now, we can't pretend as if these dates are not coming. For one, your brain remembers.
Yes.
Your body knows you're gonna have dreams. It's gonna be there. So I agree with Bree. Be intentional, prepare. Remember the last birthday. Remember, my husband had a birthday February 15th, and March, May, he was gone, you know. And remember Easter, making bun, hot cross bun, and he enjoyed that and stuff like that. And remembering the next Easter, he's not going to be there, and that kind of thing. So being very intentional, um, understand that you're not going to be able to control exactly what feelings come up. I think that for me was the scariest part. I don't know how it's going to be, even though I plan
Right.
these things. I don't know if I'm going to be "Ooh, boo, boo, boo,"
Right.
or if it's just going to be a couple of tears, or it's going to be hilarious laughter,
Right.
you know?
It's well, that is going to lead me to the next question. I'd like to welcome Maxine Cunningham, by the way. Thank you for joining us, Maxine. The randomness of grief. You know, it's so random. Like today, I could think of something about my son or even my dad, and I'm laughing. But
Yeah,
the next day, that same memory, I could be bawling my eyes out. So
absolutely.
I'd like you to address that, the randomness of
Well,
grieving.
I tell you, it is so random. It makes no sense. Okay. It's illogical. Yes. Because I remember a couple of months after my husband passed, we were preparing for a hurricane. And the normal thing is you go and make sure you got candles and flashlights and snacks and snacks and snacks. And for me, it was my first time having to secure the home, get the shutters up and, whatnot, and get the water and stuff. Those are things he would do. But I
Yes.
remember going to the grocery store and I'm getting the snacks and I'm reaching for his snacks. And I literally burst out crying in the store, stood there in a puddle of tears with people like wondering what happened. Are you okay? And then within minutes, snap right out of it, got back to what I was doing, and that too shall pass,
Yes.
So it is very unpredictable. I would
Yes.
say it's predictably unpredictable. You just never know when these emotions will come up. Um, and I can tell you the truth, because I never knew how I was going to be, I was very careful about who I spent time around. Because if I didn't think that you were going to be able to cope without chastising me, or you also breaking out in tears, I would just not go around people because I didn't feel safe for the grief, for the wave to come
Understand.
and knock me down, and you're knocked down too. So when you're supporting somebody in grief, you have to remember that this is about their pain. It's not about yours. And I'm not saying that you won't feel anything, but this is this person's experience we're talking about.
Yes.
This is Bree's grief. This is Ingria's grief. This is so and so's grief. It's not yours. So you have to come prepared and open to allow that individual to express what they're feeling.
Yes.
It's like
I
if
agree.
I'm in labor, you telling me how easy your labor was, it's not going to help mine.
I totally agree with
It's
that.
not going to work. Okay. So we just have to remember that the individual who is experiencing the grief is the person in the room, is the central person. That's the person that needs the support, the love, and the empathy.
Yes.
Because
I
they're not doing
totally
it. I
agree.
think one of the things we talk about is like people think that you're just crying or you're just trying to get somebody to pity you or sympathy. That's the last thing people who are grieving
And
want.
that's the
They don't want
truth.
sympathy. The only thing we want is for that loved one to come back. Okay,
So
we're
true.
not looking for sympathy at all. We're looking to be able, and we don't know how to walk this thing through ourselves.
It's the truth.
We know that there are phases and stages of the grief process, and you can learn them and you can study them and you can flip the page and look and say, oh, which stage is this? You know, but we don't know how they're gonna come up. We don't know which cologne scent is going to bring up something or which stupid song. You know,
Exactly.
I was in my kitchen one morning having a wonderful morning, you know, singing along, going about my business, trying to make a melody in my heart. And some song came up on the radio. And the next thing I know, I was on the floor weeping. And I don't even know the song. I know it said something about, like, if I knew you weren't going to be here, I would. And I don't even know if that song was about grief or it's about a
But
lover.
the words, I totally get it. It's
But
open to
those words,
interpretation. Yeah, it's open to how you chose to interpret it. No, I totally understand that. And it's so random. Trust me, there are days I'm sitting at my desk and I'm fighting back the tears
yeah,
for whatever reason. It it's it and it used to make me very fearful, but
Yeah.
I've come to the point where it's a normal thing now.
Normal.
So
Mm,
I'm starting to feel a little more comfortable with those emotions. I have to ask you, Angria, and I because what I'm hoping for this episode tonight is that we will leave the viewers with hope.
yes.
Is there hope for those who are grieving?
Absolutely. Look at me, guys. This is not how it started. I couldn't laugh. I had lost my laughter, my joy. I actually felt guilty about not feeling sad. After maybe 6 months, and a little bit of light came in because during grief, you feel like everything looks dark. It could be the
So
sunniest day, it looks dark.
so
Okay.
true.
So when I started seeing things as they really were, um, I started feeling a little bit guilty, like, gosh, you're forgetting him already? Even driving past the cemetery without remembering to look. I don't know what I'm looking for, that would send me into tears. Like you forgot already, you know? So things do get better.
Yes.
I am not crying every day. Bree is not crying every day anymore. There
True.
was a
It's
time
true. Right. So
when
true.
that was the case. That was the order of business. Every day I get up, first thing in the morning, thank you, Lord, for another day. Boo, he's not here,
Yes.
brushing my teeth. Boo, he's not bringing me my cup of tea. Boo, it was tears for everything. And I remember after several months, I remember when I did not cry on one day. And I suggest you celebrate. And I was like, Lord God, I didn't cry today. Like, wow, I'm getting better. And then the next day was horrible. Talk about random. The
The
next day,
randomness
crying
of it.
all day for everything. Go to the grocery store, cry. And then I noticed that there was a whole week when I didn't cry. And I'm talking about leading up to the eighth, ninth month. I have a whole week when I didn't cry. And then after that, it would start up again. So sometimes you feel like it's getting better, and then you have a setback for no known
Yes.
reason. Absolutely. And I'm not sitting down, you know, um, just thinking about my loss all day long. And for no
Right.
known reason, it's a bad week or it's a bad day. We'd say a bad day, meaning it's very heavy, you're crying, and so on. For me, it's going to be 6 years on May 18th. And I haven't cried about my loss for, I think, most of last year, I didn't cry at all. I'd have moments when I felt a little bit sad, or there would be a longing, you're missing the person and, the memories. But there is definitely hope. Hang in there. It does get a bit easier. There will always be things that you got to deal with without your loved one. There's always going to be things. Like for me, this last year, I retired. And I never dreamt that I would retire and my husband wouldn't be here. That we'd retire together, we would travel the world and all of that stuff. So that brought up a little bit of the grief there.
Yes.
Additionally, I'm planning to relocate. I'm planning to get out of my house and put it up for rent, and so that has brought up some of the emotions, but no tears. I'm not losing my sleep. I'm not eating. you
Right.
know I have put some healthy practices in place, like walking. I have a new companion, a dog, you know. It does get better, when it comes to, for instance, losing a husband or a love, the thought of remarrying or entering into new relationships. That's something that I thought about, and I'm like, I don't think I would want to experience that loss again,
Yes.
So that's partly how my grief has affected me at this time.
At
It
this
doesn't
time.
mean it doesn't mean that won't change or that can't change, you know. But it's a pain that you just don't want to relive. But it's a pain that I can assure you, as you see me sitting here, this was not the Angria in 2018, May, June, July, August, September, October. I didn't want to talk to anybody. Didn't trust. I didn't feel safe. Um, yeah. So it does get better. Uh,
And I will agree. I will agree with you on that, that it does get better. I can tell you that today being a milestone day, like I said earlier, I had to be intentional because I have accepted that he has passed away. But when those random moments hit me, I do allow myself to sit in it and to feel the grief. I do
sit there.
say to myself, I feel sad. I miss my son. The
Mhm.
one thing that has changed, because I think we, as especially we as women, we're raised to be polite. And the thing that I will no longer do, if you try to chastise me if I bring up my son, look, if you don't want to hear about my son, go the other way. But I refuse to allow anyone to chastise me for missing my son. Yes, it's been 8 years. And if you talk to me 100 years from now, I believe it will be the same.
Absolutely.
So I do think, because I was sharing with Angria, I read a post this morning, and this person is a Christian. I just felt that post was very cold. And, I think you have to be very careful with what you put out there. Like I said earlier, and Angria has said the same, when people are grieving, it's such a vulnerable time.
Mhm.
And the feeling of safety, it's gone. And it takes a while to get back to that point of embracing a new normal, to feeling like you're fitting in the world again. So if you know that if you don't have empathy or compassion or understanding, just leave grieving people alone. And one thing I have found, God will put people in your life who are understanding.
Mhm.
He will put people in your life that will give you the compassion that you may need. And if you are grieving and you have found yourself, especially at a stage of complicated grief, reach out to a grief counselor,
Yes.
reach out to your pastor, but please
Mhm.
reach out to someone. If you've begun to isolate, you
Mhm.
don't want to shower, you don't want to socialize, you don't want to eat, you don't want to sleep. There is hope at the end of the tunnel. I'm telling you, there is hope. 8 years later, I can tell you that. Yes, I did shed some tears today.
Mhm.
I'd be lying if I told you that I didn't. I cried because it's hard to stand at a grave and your child is lying in that grave. And it's just hard. Do I still believe in God? Yes. And do I have hope for the future? Yes. So that was the reason why we wanted to do this episode tonight. I've asked Angria to come back because I'd like to talk about grief and sensitivity, because I do feel that's a topic that needs to be addressed. So I would like to ask Angria, do you have any closing thoughts? And once again, I'd like to thank you. You've been wonderful tonight. You shared a lot of great information.
Thank you so much, Bree. I just want to remind people that the Bible does speak to those who mourn.
Yes.
So there is a plan. God has a plan for those who mourn. I mean, death is nothing new. to God. And he knows that it hurts. And he still called those who mourn blessed, you
Yes.
know? So he's made provision for us, for those who mourn. There are new people right now, this moment, who are just entering into grief. I would like us to be very sensitive, very compassionate. It doesn't matter where the loss occur. Since I've experienced this nature of grief, I pray for people, and I pray that God send them the right people to be with them, to support them, to love them. I was thinking about those in Gaza, and I've been praying. I cannot imagine what grief must be like for parents who watch their children killed, and it's just horrible. So
I totally agree.
just a reminder that grieving people are not out of the will of God.
I'm so glad you said that. And before we sign off, I will read Matthew chapter 5 verse 4. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted.
Thank God.
Allow We need to allow those who are grieving to mourn. There's no timeline, there's no special order, and there's no specific way. We just need to allow people who are going through a sad and difficult time to feel sad and to experience the pain. Because one thing I would say to those who are grieving, there's no escaping the pain. You're not going to jump over a hurdle and you're free. No, you have to experience the pain, but it's facing the pain that will lead you over to where you're able to be functional. And yes, you will still miss your loved one. As Angria said, we still miss our loved ones. So I would just like to thank you once again, Angria, and I would like to thank those of you who tuned in. I hope that you will walk away with some information, and please feel free to share this with someone who is grieving at the moment. And Angria, once again, I would like you to come back. Let's get together so we can talk about a date where we can address grief and sensitivity. I'd
Yeah.
like to wish everyone a good night. God bless and good night.
Bye. God bless you.